Jason wanted to take a leisurely stroll to the supermarket in Los Angeles. A routine purchase of water turned into a chase for a swindler and thief, who turned out to be part of an entire fraudulent corporation, and what happened next in this story, you will find out below. In the meantime, subscribe and like so that I know that you like the stories. The supermarket seemed like the most ordinary place to buy groceries, but for Jason Statham, even an ordinary shopping trip rarely ended simply. This time, he hoped that everything would go without incident. He walked into the store, pulling up his hood, hoping not to attract attention, and went straight to the refrigerator with water. However, even a simple purchase could not go quietly. "Hey, what are you, Jason Statham?" The excited voice of a boy was heard, who was pulling his mother by the hand. Jason sighed. He always tried to be polite to fans, but he knew that one moment of recognition could turn into a series of unwanted encounters. He nodded to the boy, hoping that this would be the end of it. But then a group of teenagers appeared nearby, already taking out their phones. "Oh, shit, it's really him," one of them said. Statham knew it was time to turn. He grabbed a bottle of water and headed deeper into the store, where there were fewer people. But luck was not on his side. In the fresh produce section, he was almost hit by a cart driven by an elderly woman with a piercing gaze. "Open your eyes, young man," she said sharply, looking straight at him. Jason barely restrained himself from chuckling. He knew that in such situations it was better to just apologize and leave, but before he could say a word, the old woman narrowed her eyes. "Do you remind me of someone? Not the one who always fights in the movies?" Her voice became suspicious. "They get away with anything, these actors of yours. What about in real life?" "Excuse me, madam, I didn't see you," he said calmly, trying not to draw even more attention to himself. But the old woman was no longer listening. She suddenly turned to the other customers and spoke louder. "There he is. Look at him. He thinks he can walk around here and push everyone around." The crowd began to gather. Jason felt the circle of people tightening around him, and it seemed like a little more and he would actually be accused of a crime. The screams of teenagers, the old lady waving her arms, the cashiers craning their necks to get a better look at the scene, it all turned into chaos. But before Statham could respond, someone shouted, "Stop! Security! He stole my bag!" Everyone froze. Jason turned sharply, meeting the gaze of a man in a blue tracksuit, who was standing at the checkout, holding an empty cart. His face was written with righteous indignation. "You took my bag of groceries." He pointed an accusing finger. Statham raised an eyebrow. He didn't even know what they were talking about. The crowd began to buzz again, now looking at him as if he really were a criminal. "Look," he said calmly, "I don't even know who you are or what bag you're talking about." But the man was already determined. "So that's it. You thought you could do anything because you were famous? I left the cart, and you just went and took my bag." Someone in the crowd muttered. "What if it's true?" Jason felt the situation spiraling out of control. He took a step forward, but at that moment the two guards who had been simply watching him moved toward him. "Sir, you're asked to stay put," said one of them, a man with a square jaw and an imposing figure. Statham rolled his eyes. He'd seen situations like this before. All it took was one misplaced word, and you'd be made to feel guilty. He took a deep breath, considering his options. But before he could do anything, another voice called out. "It wasn't him. I saw who took the bag." Everyone turned around. The woman standing by the frozen food section pointed at the guy in the gray sweater who was standing by the exit, pretending he wasn't there. As soon as everyone's eyes turned to him, he sprinted for the exit, nearly knocking the cashier off her feet. "Hey!" someone shouted. Jason didn't think twice. He hadn't meant to intervene, but his instincts were faster than his mind. He turned and made a sharp dash towards the fugitive. The guy rushed for the doors, but Statham knew he didn't stand a chance. His legs moved faster than a normal person's. In a few seconds, he caught up with the thief, grabbed him by the hood and jerked him backwards, knocking him off balance. The guy let out a frightened scream and fell to the floor, and the same bag of groceries fell next to him with a crash. Everyone froze. Then the crowd exploded with delighted shouts. He caught it. A real hero. So he's just like in the movies in real life. Statham shook his head and picked up the bag. He handed it to the man in the blue suit, who now looked embarrassed. "I think this is yours." The man opened his mouth, but said nothing. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The crowd began to laugh. Meanwhile, the security guards grabbed the thief and dragged him back into the store. People began clapping, some took out their phones to record video. Jason Statham just sighed. "And all this for a bottle of water," he muttered and headed for the exit. He was almost to the door when a nuth voice. "Hey, Statham. Did you pay for your water?" Statham stopped dead in his tracks. There was a moment of silence, then someone giggled. He slowly turned his head and saw a young cashier in a green apron with a supermarket logo standing in front of him. The guy looked clearly unsure, but decided to say what was on the tip of everyone's tongue. "Well, you just ran so fast," he shrugged. "Maybe you forgot." The crowd, which had been showering Jason with compliments just a few seconds ago, now froze in anticipation of a new scene. Some were whispering, some were taking out their phones, hoping to capture another moment. People always expected something more at such moments. Statham glanced at his hand. There was still a bottle of water in it, which he had grabbed at the beginning of this absurd trip to the store. He exhaled loudly through his nose, suppressing his irritation. That's right, he just wanted to buy some water, but ended up chasing the thief through the shelves, apprehending the thief, and now he was standing in front of a crowd that was starting to suspect him. "Yeah, you're right," he said calmly and headed for the checkout. The cashier clearly relaxed. While Statham was waiting for the item to be scanned, people surrounded him again. They no longer looked distrustful, on the contrary, there was now genuine admiration in their eyes. "That was amazing," one of the teenagers who had been filming the video said in admiration. "How did you catch him so quickly? He didn't even have time to react." "Experience," Jason replied, handing the bill to the cashier. "Well, I certainly couldn't do that," someone else muttered. Statham took the bottle of water, but before he took a step towards the exit, he heard the familiar voice again. The old woman, the same one who had accused him of being rude, was now standing next to him, looking at him intently. There was no longer the same indignation in her eyes, but rather deep thoughtfulness. "You're weird," she said, crossing her arms. "At first I thought you were just another arrogant actor, but you're not like the others." Statham grinned, taking a step toward the exit. "Thank you. I guess." The old woman muttered something under her breath again, but this time she didn't try to stop him. She looked at him, then at the guards who were still holding the captured thief, and nodded, as if she had decided something to herself. When Jason was already at the door, someone called out to him again. "Statham." He turned tiredly, expecting another stupid question, but this time the same man in the blue tracksuit stood in front of him. He scratched the back of his head awkwardly, then sighed and said, "Look. I'm sorry I accused you. I honestly thought it was you. Thanks for not letting him get away." Jason just nodded, indicating that everything was fine. He was already used to situations like this, when people quickly changed their minds, once you showed them the truth. He finally walked out of the supermarket. The evening air was fresh, unlike the stuffy room inside. He opened a bottle of water, took a couple of sips and went to his car. It seemed like the end of the story. But no. He had just opened the door of his car, when he heard the screeching of brakes. He turned around sharply, seeing an old dark van rushing across the parking lot. The car stopped abruptly near the exit of the supermarket, and two masked men jumped out. One of them was holding something like a gun in his hand. Statham just shook his head. Of course. How could it be otherwise? The thief, who was being held by the guards at the checkout, was immediately pulled towards the exit, but as soon as he saw the van, his face lit up with hope. "These are my guys," he shouted happily. The man with the gun aimed at the guards and shouted, "Let him go if you don't want any trouble." The crowd of shoppers who had just been excitedly discussing Statham's agility now scattered in panic. Some screamed, others hid behind the counters. The guards froze, clearly unsure whether to take the risk. Statham was about to intervene when he noticed movement to the side. The cashier, the same young guy who had recently been embarrassed to talk to him, now clenched his fists, clearly pondering what to do. He was standing a few steps away from the nearest fire extinguisher. Jason glanced at the thieves, then at the cashier. He realized that the guy wanted to try something, but it would be dangerous for him to act alone. The decision came instantly. He took a few quick steps forward and said loudly, "Hey, buddy." The man with the gun turned to him. That moment was enough. At the same second, the cashier rushed to the fire extinguisher, grabbed it and directed a stream of white foam straight into the armed attacker's face. He roared in surprise, and the second mask began to back away. Statham took advantage of the moment. He rushed forward, covered the distance to the criminals in 2 jumps and forcefully knocked the gun out of the hands of the first. He swung, but Statham's blow was faster, one sharp uppercut, and the man flew back, crashing into the side of the car. The second robber decided not to tempt fate. He rushed to the van, but did not have time. The guards, who had just frozen in fear, now also came to himself. 2 strong guys in uniform moved forward in unison and threw him to the ground. The crowd began to roar again, but this time not from fear, but from delight. Someone shouted, "This is just crazy. I'm making a movie in real life." Jason straightened up, casting a quick glance at the cashier, who was now breathing heavily, holding a fire extinguisher. The guy could hardly believe what had just happened. "Not bad," Statham said, clapping him on the shoulder. The cashier laughed nervously. "I don't even know what to say." "Be grateful they were so slow," Jason chuckled and turned around, heading for his car. This time he was sure, now he would definitely be able to leave in peace. Well, at least until he wanted to just buy a bottle of water again. Jason Statham got into his car and finally took a long-awaited sip of water. It was cool, but not cool enough to compensate for all the chaos that had occurred in the last 20 minutes. He exhaled, enjoying the moment of silence until the noise in the supermarket died down completely. However, when he was about to turn the key in the ignition, his intuition gave an alarm signal. He noticed movement in the rearview mirror. A man in a gray raincoat was standing nearby, pretending to dig through his phone, but his gaze was clearly riveted to Jason. Experience told the actor that this was not an ordinary onlooker eager for an autograph. His movements were too precise, his posture too tense. What else? Statham thought, continuing to secretly watch the stranger. The man took a few steps forward, but immediately stopped when he noticed that Jason was looking at him. Then he turned sharply and walked quickly towards the parking exit. Statham knew that such things do not just happen. Either this guy was up to something, or he had a good reason to hide. Forgetting about the water, he opened the door and got out of the car. The man quickened his pace, but now Statham was moving too. Without sudden movements, without unnecessary haste, but fast enough not to lose sight of him. As the stranger turned the corner of the supermarket, Jason increased his speed. He felt that a little more and he would find out what kind of game was being played here. Around the corner was a small utility area, a blank wall, a few garbage bins and a dark alley leading to a warehouse. The man in the trench coat stood with his back to him, taking something out of his pocket. "You are either very bad at surveillance, or you thought you could fool me," Jason said calmly. The man flinched, but did not turn around right away. He slowly put his hand back in his pocket and turned around, taking his time. Now Statham could see him better. He was lean but wiry, with short dark hair and the look of a man accustomed to danger. "You're quicker than I thought," he said with a slight grin. "But I think you know that." Jason crossed his arms over his chest. "Can we just get to the point? Who are you and why are you following me?" The man took a deep breath, as if deciding whether to tell the truth. Finally, he took a step forward and spoke. "My name isn't important. What's important is that I know what happened in the supermarket. And I know that was just the beginning." Statham narrowed his eyes. He didn't like riddles, especially at times like this. "What do you mean?" The stranger looked at him carefully, and then whispered. "That guy you caught. He wasn't just a thief. He didn't just happen to be in this store by chance. And if you think that's where it all ended, you're wrong." Jason wasn't one for dramatic statements, but this man clearly knew something. He looked at him carefully, waiting for him to continue. "They thought they could pull it off quietly. But you interfered. Now they'll want to get rid of you as a problem." "Who are they?" Jason asked. "People who can't stand it when someone ruins their plans. And that's exactly what you did." Jason thought about it. He'd caught a small-time criminal, stopped some robbers, but what if it was really just part of something bigger? He'd seen small-time players working for someone bigger before. And if this man was right, the evening was far from over. "You came to warn me?" Statham asked. "I came to offer a deal," the stranger nodded. "You help me deal with them, and I'll help you avoid getting trapped." Jason looked at him appraisingly. It all sounded like the beginning of another headache, but he already knew that it wouldn't go away that easily. He was used to such situations, and his intuition told him that it was better to deal with this now than to end up in the middle of an even bigger mess later. "Okay," he said finally. "But if you're lying to me—" "I'm not lying," the stranger interrupted. "And believe me, you'll find out soon enough." Jason took a deep breath, looking at him. He felt like he'd just entered a new game. And the only thing left now was to figure out how far it would take him this time. Statham stood silently, looking into the stranger's eyes, trying to read anything in them that would confirm his words. His intuition rarely failed him, but this time he felt something more than just a premonition. There was a smell of impending trouble in the air. "Okay," Jason finally said, straightening up. "Let's say I'm in." "What now?" The stranger nodded, as if expecting such an answer. "We need to get out of here. People will be arriving soon who won't like you interfering with their plans." Jason looked at him skeptically, but nodded anyway. He didn't like running from problems, but sometimes it was wiser to retreat in order to learn more. He got into the car, and the stranger quickly climbed into the passenger seat. "Where to?" Statham asked, starting the engine. "I have a place where we can hide and discuss everything in peace," the passenger replied, looking around as if checking if they were being followed. Jason pulled the car out of the parking lot and headed down the road, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. Two dark cars flashed in the rearview mirror. One was following them at a suspiciously short distance. "It looks like your friends are already here," Jason noted, slightly accelerating his pace. "Oh, shit," the stranger muttered. "We need to shake them off." "Easy," Statham chuckled, "I know how to handle situations like this." He abruptly turned onto a side street, picked up speed and swerved into a narrow alley. The cars behind him obviously did not expect such a maneuver and braked, trying to figure out where their target had disappeared to. Jason took advantage of the moment, quickly turned around and drove in the opposite direction, skillfully hiding from his pursuers. "Impressive," the stranger admitted. "Now we need to get to the warehouse outside the city. No one will find us there." "Great," Jason nodded, steering the car in the right direction. "But once we get there, you'll tell me everything without any omissions. I don't like playing guessing games." "Agreed," the passenger sighed. The journey took about 30 minutes. During this time, Jason checked several times to see if they were being followed, but it seemed they had indeed managed to escape. When they reached the warehouse, the night had already come into its own. A narrow alley led to an old, long-unused building. In the light of the headlights, all that was visible was a closed gate and peeling walls. "This place looks abandoned," Statham noted, turning off the engine. "That's the point," the stranger nodded, getting out of the car. "No one will think to look for us here." Jason followed him out and looked around. It was quiet, only a rare wind rustled the trash on the ground. The stranger took out his keys, unlocked the massive gate, and they walked inside. "Now tell me," Jason said, closing the door behind him. The stranger walked over to the old wooden table in the center of the room, brushed the dust off it and sat down, thoughtfully crossing his fingers. "It all started with one big scam," he began. "These guys aren't just a gang of petty thieves. They work for a serious organization that launders money through fake supermarkets. They use them as a cover for transporting illegal goods." "And how do you know about this?" Jason narrowed his eyes. "Because I used to work for them," the man answered calmly. "But I got tired of it. I wanted to get out, but they don't let me just disappear." Jason sighed. He was already starting to like how things were going. Another gang, another dark scheme, and now he was right in the middle of it all. "So they want you out," he concluded. "And now, because of me too." "Exactly," the man nodded. "But I have information that could destroy them. That's why I wanted to meet you. You're the only one who can help me." Jason thought about it. He hated being dragged into other people's fights, but he couldn't let things like that slide either. The only question was how deep he was willing to go. "What do you suggest?" he finally asked. The man smiled. "Let's give them some trouble." Jason Statham glanced outside through the glass doors of the supermarket. Outside, the night was quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of distant cars. But he could feel in his bones that things were not that simple. He had become accustomed to the fact that behind every minor incident there was something more. Today was no exception. A simple purchase of water turned into a clash with criminals. Now, knowing that something serious was behind it, he could not just leave. "We have to move," came the voice of a stranger, a former gang accomplice, who was now sitting across from him in an old abandoned house in the ghetto of Los Angeles. "They are not going to let this go. You are in trouble, buddy." Statham did not need reminding. He knew that after catching the thief in the supermarket, he could now be hunted by whoever was behind this scheme. But he also knew that the best way to survive was to act first. "They have a control center?" he asked. The stranger nodded. "The area is controlled by one gang. The whole block is their territory. All the records of transactions and information about the people they use are stored there. If you want to strike, this is your chance." Jason chuckled. "Who said I want that?" "Because you're not the type to leave things unfinished," the man replied with a shrug. "Besides, if you don't, they'll come after you." The decision was made. 20 minutes later, Statham was already in his car, heading to the most dangerous area of Los Angeles. He was thinking about the plan in his head: enter unnoticed, get to the computers, steal the data, exit. Simple. Theoretically. In practice, everything was more complicated. When he pulled up to his target, it was quiet. Too quiet. The block looked abandoned, but he knew that was just a disguise. He parked the car in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse and moved toward the side entrance of one of the old houses. The fence was high, but that was no problem for him. He grabbed the edge in one leap, pulled himself up, and dropped softly to the other side. Inside the area, only darkness and the occasional glimmer of light from the windows greeted him. He quickly found a blind spot and moved on. Voices could be heard from further down the street. Jason froze, trying to make out the words. The men were discussing a shipment of goods. So there really was business going on here. He slipped inside through the side door of the abandoned building and moved down the dark corridor. A creak. Someone was approaching. Jason ducked behind the nearest column, holding his breath. A security guard walked past, idly picking at his phone. Statham didn't waste time on him, letting him go. He needed information, not unnecessary fights. Next he found the equipment room. Picking the lock wasn't difficult. Monitor screens flickered inside, illuminating the room with a dim light. He sat down at the keyboard, inserted the flash drive, and began copying files. Go ahead, he muttered, watching the loading indicator. Footsteps were heard outside the door. Several people. He pulled out the flash drive a second before the door swung open. Who are you? One of the men shouted, grabbing for his weapon. Jason didn't wait. With one leap, he knocked down the closest opponent, knocking the gun away. A shot rang out, but the bullet went into the ceiling. He elbowed the second man in the jaw, then yanked the third around and sent him face first into the wall. But the time was lost. An alarm siren wailed over the block. Jason grabbed the flash drive and rushed for the exit. Behind him, he could hear the shouts and footsteps of his pursuers. He ran out into the yard, but they were already waiting for him. Several armed men surrounded him, aiming directly at him. He raised his hands, assessing the situation. Game over, buddy, one of them sneered. You thought you could just walk in and out? Jason sneered back. No. I thought I could put on a show. He darted to the side, kicking up a handful of dust from the ground and throwing it into the eyes of the nearest enemy. At the same time, he lunged forward, knocking the weapon away from one of the guards and throwing it aside. A series of blows rang out, one by one, the enemies fell to the ground. But there were too many of them. Jason dodged for cover, dodging bullets. He ran along the wall, jumping over trash cans. There had to be an exit somewhere ahead. He had almost reached the alley when he heard the roar of an engine. A black SUV was rushing straight at him. He managed to jump to the side, rolling onto the ground. The car sped past, but was already turning around for a second pass. Statham jumped to his feet and darted towards the truck parked at the exit of the block. There was one last chance. He took the remote out of his pocket and pressed the button. The street shook from the explosion. The explosives he had planted in advance worked perfectly, turning the building into a fiery hell. While his pursuers were trying to come to their senses, Jason jumped into the truck, started it and broke out onto the road. He pressed the gas pedal, feeling the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. In his hands was a flash drive with evidence. Now the hardest part remained, figuring out what to do with it next. And he knew the game wasn't over yet. Jason Statham sped through the Los Angeles night, clutching the flash drive with the stolen data. His heart was beating steadily, his breathing was calm, he had been in this situation too many times. But he knew it was just the beginning. Car headlights flashed in the rearview mirror. The pursuit did not stop. Those he had angered in the ghetto were not going to let him go so easily. A black SUV was flying behind him, and inside, most likely, there were armed thugs ready to open fire at the first opportunity. Okay, guys, let's see what you can do, Statham thought, pressing the gas pedal. He abruptly turned into an alley, his wheels screeching on the asphalt. The car swerved, but held its course. The SUV did not have time to repeat his maneuver and crashed into dumpsters. Statham got a few seconds head start. But it was too early to relax. He knew this was not the end. His target was a journalist, a man who could make this data public. On the flash drive were financial transactions, connections, and evidence of crimes that could destroy the entire gang. But getting to the journalist was not an easy task. Jason knew that they were waiting for him. In the distance, his destination loomed, a small newspaper building that had not yet sunk into corporate hands. He parked the car in the shadows and got out, looking around. The office was lit only by a couple of dim lamps. Inside, a man named Miles was waiting for him, the only journalist he could trust. He climbed the stairs and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it opened, and a tired middle-aged man with glasses appeared on the threshold. "Damn, Jason, you have no idea how much trouble you caused me," Miles muttered, letting him inside. "Good to see you, Miles," Statham chuckled, closing the door behind him. "I have something interesting." He held out the flash drive. The journalist glanced at it, then at Jason, and sighed heavily. "Let me guess. This is what half the city is after you for." "Exactly. It has everything you need to shut this gang down for good. The question is, can you use it before they get here?" Miles thought for a second, then quickly inserted the flash drive into his laptop and began to look through the files. His eyes widened. This is fucking serious," he muttered. "If this gets out, not only the gang, but several corrupt officials will end up behind bars." At that moment, the sound of cars approaching was heard outside the window. Jason immediately went to the curtain and looked out. Several cars pulled up outside the building, and armed men got out. "We have company," he said calmly, pulling out his gun. "Do you have a plan other than dying for the truth?" Miles swallowed nervously, then quickly grabbed his phone. "I can send the data to the editor and a few trusted people. If something happens to me, it will still end up on the network." "Then hurry," Jason checked the clip. "I'll make sure you get there in time." There was a sound from below of a door breaking down. The first men entered the building. They moved quickly and efficiently, professionals. But Jason was ready. The first steps on the stairs, and there was a dull thud. The first opponent fell, having taken a boot to the chest. Statham cut off the second with a sharp blow to the elbow. The others opened fire. He slid to the side, going behind the wall, and raised his weapon. One shot, two opponents fell to the floor. The others began to surround him, but he was moving faster than they could have predicted. "Here!" Miles shouted, holding out the flash drive. "It's all loaded. Now we have to get out of here. Follow me," Jason commanded, fighting his way to the exit. Bullets whistled past him, but he didn't stop. He kicked in the back door and pushed the journalist out. At that moment, an explosion sounded behind him. Someone threw a grenade inside. Fire and smoke enveloped the building, but Jason had already led Miles outside. Their car was parked nearby. "Let's go," the journalist shouted, jumping behind the wheel. Jason jumped into the passenger seat, and Miles pressed the gas pedal. The car took off, carrying them away from the burning building. But this was not the end. Now that the truth was out in the open, it was just a matter of waiting to see who would fall first in this game. And Jason knew his job wasn't done yet. The city was ablaze with headlines. All the information from the flash drive was leaked online, hitting the Los Angeles underworld like a tsunami. Corrupt officials, gang leaders, shadowy figures, they were all now in the crosshairs. But Jason Statham knew it wasn't over. It wasn't just thugs who were after him now, but people who were used to staying in the shadows. He sat in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, watching the news. The phone rang. It was Miles. "Jason, we did it. But they're still coming for us." "I know. Where are you?" "The newsroom. They're already tracking me, but I've leaked copies of the data to multiple independent sources. If something happens to me, it won't stop. Stay there. I'll handle it." Jason stepped outside. The air was tense. He knew they were waiting for him. He was ready. 20 minutes later, he stood in front of the editorial office. The lights were on, but the atmosphere was ominous. He walked inside slowly, sensing an ambush. The first blow came from the right. He dodged, putting his elbow out. The attacker fell, not having time to understand what had happened. The second one rushed at him with a knife, but Jason intercepted his hand and threw him over himself. A shot rang out. He dodged to the side, the bullet whistled past. Jason pulled out a pistol and sent the attacker to the floor with one precise shot. "Statham," a voice rang out. A man in an expensive suit stood at the end of the corridor. It was Michael, the man who had ordered it. "Did you really think you could ruin everything?" he grinned. "I don't think I do," Jason answered. There was a short pause. Then Michael pulled out a gun, but Jason was faster. One well-placed shot, and the man who had kept half the city in fear fell to the floor. Miles ran out of the office. "It's over." Jason nodded. The police arrived in 5 minutes. Now that the main suspect was dead and the information was out, the system was starting to crumble. He stepped outside, feeling the tension ease. This chapter was over. He had done what he had to. Now there was only one thing left to do: disappear. The car was already waiting for him. He got behind the wheel, looked in the rearview mirror and smiled. The city lived its own life. But now, without him. Jason Statham stepped on the gas and disappeared into the night.